two families were, very prominent throughout the 1800s, owned and built a number of interesting old homes that many of which are still with us. Um, but there are a bunch of other families in the area, the Dawsons, the Dysons, the Brewers, the Trundles, that also show up frequently when we're looking at old houses. And sometimes it's kind of fun to, I think, kind of trace a little bit of a family tree to see kind of what they contributed in terms of old structures to the ag reserve. I'll also tell you, and I'll show you here in a second, it gets so confusing so fast because, you know, when we think about this area in the late 1700s, early 1800s, there weren't that many people here. And so if you were a guy looking for a wife or vice versa, your options were fairly limited. And as a result, what we see is just a whole lot of intermarrying between these families that we've all heard of. And so when we start to dig in and try to look back, and Glenn knows this just from all the work he's done on Find a Grave, when you start to try to like map back these family trees, they get very tangled very quickly, just because in a lot of cases you've got cousins marrying each other from different families, which we would frown upon today, but that was very much a normal practice, especially in rural areas, back in the early 1800s. And the Brewers really are no different here. So the Brewer family, as far as I can tell, and it was interesting, I couldn't get a ton of specific information, but as far as I can tell, the Brewers came from England, over to the eastern shores and the Annapolis area of Maryland, in the either in the late 1600s or early 1700s. And again, I was a little surprised because there actually is a lot of documentation on the Brewers, especially in our area, starting here with William, but his parents and beyond were more difficult to locate. But Brewers, they come into eastern Maryland. They settle somewhere near Annapolis, and William, amongst other siblings, is born just outside of Annapolis in 1777. And we'll get more into his story here, but essentially he's raised out in that area. He moves to the area that we now know as the Ag Reserve, specifically kind of the Bellsville area, in the very, very early 1800s. And this is after attending medical school at University of Pennsylvania. He does something pretty smart. It seems like he already came, the Brewers were already pretty wealthy, so he already had kind of a leg up. And then he married into the Chiswell family, which was very wealthy and prominent in the area. So he had kind of, two positive things going for him there in terms of financial means. He, like I said, he went to medical school. He was also a very successful farmer. He's described as being very innovative in his farming techniques, and also really found that collaboration across farmers in the area was really important. So he's actually the one that started the Medley district, which is this district of the Western Ag Reserve that we all live in here around Poolesville. He actually started the Agricultural Society of the Medley district, recognizing that there was some value in kind of sharing tactics and techniques across farmers. William, we believe, served in the War of 1812 as a field surgeon. And I can only imagine what field surgery looks like in the world. We know what it looked like in the Civil War in the 1860s. So I can't imagine what it was like in the War of 1812. But we have some indications that he did that, and that his service actually slowed down the completion of his large estate at Aix-la-Chapelle, which we've talked about many times before, but I'll show it to you here. His wife, Mary, again, a Chiswell. So her father was Joseph Newton Chiswell, and Joseph was the son of Stephen Newton Chiswell. So we've talked about this before, but Stephen Newton Chiswell was the individual who came from England in the 1730s, shipwrecked off the coast of Rhode Island, and then made his way down to Maryland after, being rescued there. He went to work for his uncle as a kind of a, I don't know, a helper or assistant in, I think in what we would now consider PG County, if I believe, and then moved to this area, we think in the 1740s. So when Stephen Newton Chiswell got here in the 1740s, him and his wife built essentially a log cabin out where, if you know where like the orchards are, just outside of Poolesville, Horines and the other one that it's like escaping me. That is where they initially settled before building Chiswell's inheritance in the 1790s. So my guess is that Mary, being born in 1782, was likely born either at that log cabin, because the Chiswell's inheritance that her father was building was not quite yet completed. You can see, though, in her life, I mean, she gave birth to 16 children. Only 10 survived past into adulthood. And again, that's one of those trends we've talked about before, but I'm just always struck by how much loss of life, especially of children, there was in these days. It's something that, I think probably we take a little bit for granted, just given the current modern, marvels of medicine. But, these families would have 16 children just so that they could get, 6 to 10 into adulthood. Right. And so, certainly a lot of loss, that William and Mary faced, in their efforts to bring children into the world. So again, they get married in 1800, and start having a number of children. These were, actually, you know what? I lied to you. I said 10 made it into adulthood. It was actually 6. So 6 out of 16, even worse odds. These were the 6. They did have one daughter. Most of their children died, it appears, at birth. They had one daughter who made it to the age of 21, and I'm not sure what occurred there. It was likely some kind of disease, but these were the 6 that really made it into adulthood. And as you can see, what I've tried to do is just kind of indicate where these children and their spouses kind of settled and ended up, and in most cases passed away. I think in all cases, except for maybe John and Elizabeth over here on the far left, everybody else, after passing away, was buried at, initially at Aix-la-Chapelle, which is kind of, I think we can consider the home base for the Brewer family. Again, built by Dr. William Chiswell, and I'll show it to you in a second. Those at least the stones, and Glenn, we believe the bodies were moved from Aix-la-Chapelle in the early 1900s out to Monocacy Cemetery. But so this is just kind of like a rough mapping of the family tree to show kind of where these individuals went. And so what I wanted to do was kind of talk about William and Mary and their home at Aix-la-Chapelle, and then highlight these homes and these individuals that had the homes in Poolesville. And then at the end, I'll show you a little bit of a description for James and Mary Brewer from Winchester and New Orleans. So I mentioned that Dr. Brewer was born outside of Annapolis, and we have, I don't have a birth record, but we do have baptismal records of his baptism. He was baptized, I think it looked like it was only 3 or 4 days after his birth, and it was at All Hallows Church just outside of Annapolis. This I mean, I didn't know this before digging into this, but this church actually has been around since the late 1600s. It's one of the most historic churches in the state of Maryland. And he was baptized here. And this church is still very much, you can see the bottom right, this is a very recent picture, still an active congregation, which is kind of amazing, right? That we still have congregations here in America that have been going strong since the 1600s. It's awesome. I think it's really cool. So again, I don't know for sure where he was born. We can guess that it was in very close proximity. I spent a lot of time on the map looking at kind of the list of historic properties within 20 miles of this church, and I didn't find anything with that clearly stated. This was the Brewer household to give me an indication of that's probably where he was born, but we can be sure that it was somewhere relatively close by. And then for Mary, as I mentioned, being born in the 1780s, her grandfather, like we talked about, Stephen, had moved to this area and built this log cabin on the far left in the 1740s. And then Stephen and his son, Joseph, began work at some point in the late 1700s on Chiswell's inheritance. And Chiswell's inheritance was completed in the 1790s, but it's possible that they were living there in some form of the partially completed structure in the 1780s. But my money would say that Mary was born in one of these two structures in the 1780s, right? This log cabin on the left, I've shown it to you before. It was standing until the 1980s. It was actually, I think, lived in until the 70s. It never had running water, and it just reached a point in the 80s where it just, it's a wooden structure that's built in the 1740s, is very difficult to keep standing, and it just reached a point where it was just not in good enough condition to keep up and becoming a safety hazard, so it was brought down. Although I do know from talking to the prior owners that a lot of the beams and a lot of the structures, especially on the inside, were reused in other structures around the area. So that's always a positive. On the right, Chiswell's inheritance, we've talked about this one many times before, but this is the structure just outside of town. I think it was 1796 it was completed. And one of those places where on the interior, it really does feel like you're stepping back into the early 1800s when you step inside there. Really beautiful, super important historic structure when we think about the beginning of arguably the most prominent family in the 1800s in this area, the Chiswells. Either them or the Whites, I would say, probably the two biggest ones. But the Brewers are probably a close third. And so, we can see this is where this story starts to intermingle. So Mary from the Chiswells and William from the Brewer family, they get married in 1800. William fights, as we talked about, in the War of 1812, or not, I guess I shouldn't say fight. He was a surgeon, but he was involved in the War of 1812. And it's a little unclear from the records. We think he started work on his property Aix-la-Chapelle, which you can see here, possibly before that time. And then there was a pause due to his service. But the property was completed in 1812, so it's always a little murky that far back. But around that time, he builds this home. You can see it's pretty standard federal style home. You can see that from the symmetry. Like a lot of old homes here in the Ag Reserve, what we had was kind of chimneys on both sides. A lot of these old homes had these small little front porches that at some point later were removed. And then on the far right, what you're looking at there is that's the summer kitchen where certainly enslaved persons before 1864 were working and cooking. This picture is from the Historic American Building Survey, the 1930s. And so it looks like by the 30s, what they had done, which we've seen it at a couple of other places, is they built some kind of passageway, essentially connecting that summer kitchen to the main home. When this property was first built, this kitchen would have been separate, physically separated from the house, so that any fires occurring in the kitchen would stay there and not spread to the main structure. So really beautiful old home, fairly straightforward in design, pretty similar to some of the others we've seen in the area. I mean, it reminds me a little bit of East Oaks out towards White's Ferry. Um, a little bit of some of the properties. I guess kind of spread throughout. I'm thinking of Inverness and some of the others. This is what it looks like more recently. And so I think we had Aix-la-Chapelle on one of our tours 2 years ago. But you can see, if you look at the bottom left, this is what would have been this center area is that same centerpiece that you're looking here. Okay. So you can see at some point, and I believe it was in the 40s or the 50s, when the Schober family owned this home, they cut into the attic and built these dormers on the top, right? So you don't see these dormer windows up here on the roof line. And then they got rid of the summer kitchen and they built these large wings that are symmetrical off on either side. So those are 1940s, 1950s edition. It's really this center block that is kind of the main historic part of the structure. And then what we also have, what's interesting, is this little structure. It's standing really, really close. You can see it down in the bottom right, standing super close to the house. And what this is, was, we believe, or almost positive, was Dr. Brewer's doctor's office. So this was where he was actually treating patients. The current owners have done a really good job of keeping the inside very original. And I think I've talked about this before, but something really fascinating that they found was in the upstairs. There's like upstairs is a kind of a strong word. It's more of like a little loft area, but up there on the wall, there's actually graffiti. And what we believe is that patients who were really sick, or Dr. Brewer was concerned with, he had them actually sleep over in the doctor's office. And I'm not sure how it started, but at some point people decided that they would start writing their names on the walls. And so even today, there's a little ladder in there. You can climb up and you can look, and you can still see in pencil a bunch of names kind of written all over the walls that we believe were likely patients that were spending the night there for one reason or another. So really kind of a cool little interesting tidbit. The other thing that I would say that's kind of like got me thinking just today doing some research is, for those of you familiar with Rockville, there's I think it's Dr. Stone or Dr. Stone Street. One of the two, but he built a little doctor's office down there in Rockville. He was a physician in that area in the 1800s, and it looks really, really similar to this. And I wouldn't have really thought much more of that, except for the fact that one of Dr. Brewer's sons here actually moved into a home in the 1800s in Rockville, within a block or two of that doctor's office. So part of me is almost wondering now if one copied the other, if they learned from somehow there was some kind of relationship, and that's the reason that these two structures are so similar, or the idea for building this kind of structure could also just be pure coincidence. Dr. Stone Street. Yeah. Thanks, Denise. So I mean, beautiful historic home. So what I wanted to do was kind of talk through some of their children here. So Nicholas was one of their older children, born in 1818. He became a physician, just like his father. He married twice. His first wife passed away after giving birth to a few children. His second wife, Ruth, you can see here, they were married, I believe, in the 1850s. You can see a little bit of an age difference there, 20 years. So, no judgment. That's cool. So this was Nicholas and Ruth. They lived here in Greenwood. The records say it was built in 1850. I think it was a little bit earlier than that. I think it was in the late 1840s. But Greenwood is a home. It's right on 28 if you're leaving Bellsville. If you're at the Bellsville kind of stoplight there, and you're heading like you're going to leave Poolesville and go towards Germantown, right before you get to the intersection of 28 and Buck Lodge there, you'll see Greenwood on your left. It's relatively close to the road. I think there's even a little sign there that says Greenwood. So the home is still very much there. You can see this. It was for sale a few years ago. And so I did the thing I always do when these old homes are for sale. I go in and act like I'm interested in potentially buying it, even though it was like a couple of $1 million, and that was not going to happen. But it's I mean, really, really pretty home. I don't. It was covered in stucco in the 1920s. So when this was initially built, it was in brick, or actually, I believe it was in stone. And you can see just really interesting details. This is one of those homes that kind of reminds me of. Um, it has like at least on the interior, more of a southern feel to it. It reminds me of some of the homes that I've been in. I lived in Savannah for a number of years, and it feels layout wise more like a southern home where it's relatively narrow in the front but goes back really, really far. This picture doesn't do it justice. But just a really beautiful old home that Dr. Nicholas Brewer lived in. And yeah, so where's this property in relation to town for us newbies? So it would be like, it's hard to, I guess it would be technically northeast. So if you were to leave Poolsville on Elgin Road towards Bellsville, and then when you get to Bellsville, turn right and go down that and just keep going down. That's a big main road, about maybe
Yes.
2 miles. It'll be on your left. That's where Jim says that John and Joseph Pool's grandmother, Joanna Duval Pool, was buried at All Hallows. That's interesting. Yeah, yeah, and Jim makes the point that's the third church built on that site. That's a good point. So that church that I was showing you all earlier,
Really?
it was I believe it had a fire and was actually burnt down once or twice, like a lot of old structures in these parts. So yeah, good point, Jim. Okay, so then another son, a little bit younger, 4 years younger than Nicholas, was George Brewer. George married Aletha. I'm not sure how to pronounce that. It's kind of an odd name, but they were married, and George's father, Dr. Brewer, who, in addition to being a doctor and a farmer, was also very interested in acquiring real estate and property. And again, the fact that he married into the Chiswell family was very advantageous in that way. He got a lot of land given to him or sold to him from Stephen and Joseph Chiswell, who owned a lot of property. And so he gave a parcel of the property known as Woodstock to his son George, and they moved into this area in the 1830s before building a home here, we think around 1850. So Woodstock, and what you're looking at here is a very rough picture, but if any of you have been to the Woodstock Equestrian Park, just as you're kind of go to Bellsville, but go left down past the cemetery, and it's right there, kind of both on your right and your left, there's entrances. If you go to the right up there at the equestrian park, maybe some of you have been there, you'll still see some of these structures, especially these two on the right. So there's I guess it was an ice house in the bottom right, and then in the upper right, this was actually the enslaved quarters, which is still there. Some of these wooden structures are gone, but this is where George built his farmstead and kind of continued to build a series of barns and a bunch of different kind of outbuildings. Very, very successful farmer on this land, and farmed here for most of his life before, in his, I believe, 70s or 80s, passed it on to his son, and then actually moved back into Aix-la-Chapelle. His parents, Dr. Brewer, had passed at that point. So what's like very frustrating to me about this Woodstock Equestrian Park is that there's tons of work that's been done to take pictures and catalog all of the outbuildings of this property. I cannot find a single picture of the actual home that George lived in, which is weird to me. But even in the county historic records, there's a sign out there that shows kind of a layout of the farm, and they have what looks like maybe a rough picture of the house, but it's really poor quality. So Jim, I'm assigning you this one. If you can find me a picture of George's house, that would be awesome, because I have failed trying to locate that. That's the only kind of piece of this puzzle missing. Is I would love to see what that old home looked like. I believe a lot of these structures especially these wooden ones, were torn down around 2000 when the county was turning this into the equestrian park. They left the stone structures here. But the records seem to indicate that the main home of George was torn down in 1983. So it's been gone for a while, but not so long that we shouldn't have pictures of it. They've got to be out there somewhere. So anyway, if anybody has any leads on that one, I will be very interested. Okay, and then some of you might have been here before, which is Susanna Farm, also out in the general area, kind of moving towards Boyd's. These were, Joseph, and he married Warnetta, and they moved out here I believe in the 1840s or 50s. I think it was either the Dysons or the Dawsons. I always get them mixed up, that initially built this home. Susanna Farm I've never actually been to the home myself. I need to go out there, but I think it's now kind of like a garden center where you can go buy different kind of plants. But you can see the structure here. The main structure is on the left, and then there was this wing that was added in the late 1800s. So when we look at this, it's a really impressive profile here. But so this, I think, is kind of the quote newer part of the house, in that it was built in the late 1800s. So this is kind of the side, and again, this is the front. So the side here is on the right, like this part is what we're looking at here. So just really beautiful old home. Kind of, I always love when we see kind of this intermixing of architectural styles here. A lot of times with kind of these, it's like this old farmhouse, but Gothic farmhouse look. We've got the rounded windows, the rounded shutters there that have kind of that Gothic or almost Italianate styling, and then a lot of kind of just the more simplistic designs that we see at a lot of just historic farmhouses in the area. So just a really cool old home. You can always really tell around here, at least to me, you can always really tell when an old home is truly old by looking at the foundation here. And when we see stuff like this, where it's like clearly stone that was painted over, that's always like a pretty good indication that, like, yeah, this is an old house. It's been here for a while. But really cool place. I haven't been up to it in close proximity myself, but I would like to get out there sometime soon. In fact, just finding these pictures yesterday was a good reminder to put this one back in the list. Okay, so I mentioned that two of the children ended up in Winchester, Virginia, and then another down in New Orleans, of all places. And so I just wanted to kind of highlight one of the things that I've really been experimenting with is, as our artificial intelligence capabilities seem to be getting better and better with our large language models, can we start to use things like ChatGPT to get us a quick feed on old people or places from this area?
Yeah.
So what you're reading here is not my writing. This is computer generated based on me asking it, tell me everything you know about. I asked it to tell me about Amishadi Moore. This was the husband of Mary Brewer, and I asked about Amishadi because that is such a weird name. I knew that it would be quite distinct, and so it looks like the Moore family was prominent out in this area of Clark County, which is just east of Winchester. So it's actually not that far from us, really. And some point, not sure how, but Mary and Amishadi met and were married and then lived out there. He was a relatively, it seemed like he was maybe in banking in addition to farming out there. And then his son, Amishadi Jr., as you can see here, served in the Confederate Army during the Civil War. Doesn't really surprise me. Enlisted at the age of 16, which you could do during the Civil War, but or you could get away with at least. But Yeah, so that's kind of the extent of what we know. I wasn't able to find any historic homes associated, but that's kind of where Mary went from the family. And then James, not sure what caused it, always hard to know, but went down to New Orleans. And so you can see here, the records seem to be a little bit unclear of whether he was kind of going in the family direction of medicine, or if he was going into law. His older brother, who had gone to Rockville, was a pretty successful lawyer, so he was potentially following that route. But he ended up in New Orleans and getting married down there. When he passed away in the 1880s, he was still brought back here to this area and initially buried at Aix-la-Chapelle, the again kind of the Brewer base of operations before being reinterred out at Monocacy Cemetery. Um, so so yeah, it's just kind of interesting to see how these individuals and these family trees kind of move across the country into different areas and different locales. It seems like they all kind of followed, fairly well trodden paths at those point of farming, law, and medicine. So no surprise there. That's kind of what you would do if you were coming from a prominent family at those points. Um, but just kind of an interesting look at the Brewer family as a pretty important family in the ag reserve throughout this time period. All right, so that was kind of quick. Any questions I can answer about that or anything?
I- Kenny, I was just asking a question, and you'll forgive. As I said, I'm kind of a neophyte, but I am so privileged to live in the reserve now, and I am like you, kind of passionate about the older situations and people. Why did they move them from those homes that were sort of family, treasures to Monocacy?
Yeah, I mean, and Glenn, feel free to chime in on this too, because you'll know better. Pat, you should know, Glenn Wallace on here is kind of the resident county global
Historian.
expert on
Yes, I've
historic
had.
cemetery specifically, and but my general sense is that well, I think some families were just concerned of how long will this home stay in the family, and is it potentially more
Yeah, yeah,
secure to keep all of our family members in kind of a designated location that is going to be a cemetery in perpetuity. But
right.
Glenn, I'd love to hear your thoughts on that. I'm curious
Sure,
myself.
sure, absolutely. I think the reason is that George Brewer was one of the first board members of Monocacy Cemetery when it
Oh,
incorporated in 1874.
hmm,
They got themselves a nice
Okay.
prime family lot there. They are in, I believe, Row
Hmm.
D, and put up a beautiful obelisk monument that is well taken care of by one of his descendants, Betty Brewer McCullough. And I think that's the reason he just
hmm.
decided that the family should be together in a formal cemetery setting.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
that makes a lot of sense.
Wow.
Um, Glenn, how confident are you that it's not just the stones that were moved there?
It's bodies.
It is. Oh, okay.
It is body. It is remains.
Okay.
Yeah, I know that I know that we are still trying to find the slave burial grounds
Yeah,
at Chappelle, and it's
I
not
know.
very, it's not very giving. There's no clues available to us,
Yeah,
but
yeah.
yeah,
Yeah, Glenn and I have been well, I went out and I think Glenn's gone out separately and we've looked at a lot of these properties and it should be said, I mean, I didn't probably say it enough, but the Brewers, um, amongst other families in the area, certainly had a lot of enslaved persons in their possession until 1864. And so at all of these properties, there was slavery present, especially Aix-la-Chapelle. We have there's plenty of written record. There's a really interesting letter. It's kind of a field note from a captain in the Union Army writing back to General Stone, who was in charge of this area, that they had done a raid on Aix-la-Chapelle looking for some illegal contraband, and that they had found it within the enslaved quarters. And I think it was like whiskey and a saber and a pistol, or, but it was just an interesting commentary. But again, further proof that it was there. And the question that a lot of us have is, where are all those persons that were enslaved? Where are they potentially buried? The community of Jerusalem, which is a historically Black community there, still present, is essentially right across the road from Aix-la-Chapelle. And we know that many of those that had been enslaved on that farm after being emancipated in 1864 kind of moved over and kind of built that community, likely continued to farm in that same property that they had when they were enslaved, but now free and kind of starting. And so many of the formerly enslaved were likely buried there in the Jerusalem cemetery. But we also know that there's some on that property. It's just finding enslaved graves is incredibly difficult, because in most cases there's very little to no markings, not like big stones that we see in other cemeteries.
And also traditionally, when bodies have been removed from a family homestead, there is some sort of landscaping that would give a clue as to where it was formerly located, by periwinkle, lines of cedar trees that would set out corners. And typically the enslaved cemetery was in proximity to the family cemetery, because in most cases these slaves were not treated horribly. They were part of the life of the family, and they designate an area 250 feet, typically 250 feet to 500 feet away from the family home. And we've done radius studies at Aix-la-Chapelle, and we could not find anything that it was either landscaped over after the bodies were removed, or something, or they built something on top of it, because they have all those barns to the north of Aix-la-Chapelle, where the festivities, the activities,
and the ponds, maybe they're
and their ponds. Well, it would typically wouldn't be on the south side, because that was the view side.
That's true.
So they wouldn't have put the cemetery. But it's interesting. Other locations that we've done, Kenny, you and I did one together on Bullsville. We found markers, not markers, I should say, field stones in set orders next to the family burial ground. And I thought that was just an interesting case study. But it seems to be a typical thing. The county archaeologist, Brian Crane, informed me last Saturday that they found the location of the Trundle Shreve burial ground, which is currently under the Pepco power plant. He was able to find the coordinates, the GPS coordinates for where it used to be. There's nothing there anymore, unfortunately. They're all brought over to Monocacy Cemetery. But it seems to be a typical thing that the Jones family, the Darby family, obviously the Brewers, the Joneses, the Pools, all brought their family members into Monocacy. Not too long after,
Glenn,
probably go ahead.
I was just going to ask you, have you ever been to the cemetery that was set up at Washington's Mount Vernon for the enslaved people? Have you ever been there?
Yes, I have. Yeah.
It is an amazing garden. And some of the questions that you were posing in terms of how people were identified or not identified is very interesting when you see that facility. It's an amazing place.
Yeah, typically if you had money on a plantation, you spent the money on the family marker. Unfortunately, the enslaved people, all they could afford, not that they couldn't afford it, they didn't afford it. They didn't want their marker to be anything that resembled wealth. So in their typical African tradition, they would normally just plant a yucca plant. A yucca plant, You can't kill them.
Yeah.
So they just keep growing year after year after year. But it does mark a spot of a burial, and you'll see them in
Yes.
cemeteries now. But in most cases, the tradition became a stone, and the stone is not just a random stone. The stone is set
No.
upright. You'll see it,
Yes. Yes.
with purpose, sitting upright in the ground. But
Yes.
yeah, very interesting.
Yeah, it really is. We have so
Yeah.
much. Thank you so much.
Oh, you're
It's
very welcome.
so to
I
listen to.
would love for you all to come out and visit the Brewer markers, the grave sites. I did have a thought. It would be really nice. I know that the George Brewer lot right now seems to be grassless. It is under cover, and I thought it would be really interesting if we could get some square footage of turf brought over from Aix-la-Chapelle to be replanted
Cool.
on their graves.
Wow.
Yeah, that would be a really nice tribute to them, just to bring some home back to them.
Yeah,
Cool idea.
absolutely.
Yeah.
Wow.
Anybody else?
Glenn,
Thank you.
hi. Glenn, hi, it's Connie and Catherine.
Hi, Connie.
So hi, honey. So we're part of the Chiswell inheritance, and we still have that stone that the original house was built on with
Right.
a pretty big root cellar. We've got some documents that Kenny will send to you.
Yeah.
Talks about the Underground Railroad, and it's fascinating to hear about this history that's right in our backyard. So look forward to connecting with you. They did not burn the house down. We've built around it. And back in Snowmageddon, there was a leak upstairs. And when they
Yeah.
were replacing the drywall, the gentleman who was doing the work started screaming. We didn't know what was going on, but he'd actually exposed the original part of the home. And so we look forward to connecting with you when it's convenient and to take a look at, we've got a ton of photos of the original house and a ton of, we've got a great article about the history of it, and it was a bootlegger happening. But what we are most fascinated with is the part that it has been suggested that it was part of the Underground Railroad, which we would not be surprised. Hopefully we'll be able to connect in the next month or so and get you some photos and get you to get out here and take a look at it. But the stone main part of the house exists, and the original house was not burned down, and it was built over. So
Very cool. Yeah, no, I look forward to it. Yeah, send me what you got. I'm interested to take a look for sure.
In 1864, Dr. Nicholas Brewer had, I think, 18 slaves that he claimed for reimbursement for their freedom.
Right.
And the last names were Jackson's, Crampton, Johnson, Beckwith, Harper, Brown, Coates, Harris, Harper.
Is
Harris,
that
Nolan.
what's the sourcing on that, Jim? Is that from like the census or?
This is
1840s,
1867.
1867. Very good.
Yeah, after the war, they were going to pay us for our slaves to stay in, but never got around to it.
So they were still on the property after the emancipation.
No, this is just slaves that they owned that were freed.
Okay.
And if you could prove that you owned them, you could get
I see.
$300.
Got it.
And if they enlisted, you got more.
Interesting.
On the house you were asking about, you need to talk to Randy.
To who?
Randy Davis.
Oh, does he have it?
He did a mystery history on 28th of May, 2004, and has a picture of the house on it.
All right.
You may have a lot more.
Well,
So he's in the sea, or you can look it up on the comical site.
I'll send it to Randy now. Sounds good. Thanks, Jim.
That's awesome.
It pays to have a scrapbook.
Oh my God, you're going to put those scrapbooks in
I'm
the National
laughing.
Archives.
Oh, I gave Medley my digging record. So
Okay,
they would have a record of where I've been.
there you go.
So anytime they want to start fighting the city hall, they can say, well, there was a Yankee camp there.
It's awesome.
Anybody else?
Well, thank you for coming tonight.
So many questions. Thank you for having us.
Definitely.
Thank
And
you very much for having us.
Did you have something to add, Pat?
No, I just wanted to say thank you so much for doing this. You know, it's, as I said, my family we are very much neophytes at this, but being here in the Ag Reserve is something that we treasure, and learning more about how it has been preserved and how we can continue to add to that capability of preserving something that is very unusual in the United States today, is something that we would like to learn more about. Thank you.
Thank you. And thanks, Kenny, for all of your research and knowledge.
Yeah.
And I hope you'll be able to join him and us on July 18th, which is his next session. So
Sounds good.
thank you and have a good night.
See y'all.
Thank you all.
Thanks,
Thank you,
Kenny.
Yep.
Thank you.
See you.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye.
Mm.